this video is going to be kind of longer than what I usually do, so here are the timestamps if you just want to hop into one area. The Caucasus region has usually been sandwiched by many empires. Due to the sandwiching, the Caucasus region was usually split up by these empires, with the southern regions at times falling under the control of organized Middle Eastern states, or the Romans, and the northern Caucasus region mostly ruling over themselves and each other, mostly thanks to the mountains that surrounded them and helped prevent invasions or made invasions very costly. This would change when the Russian Empire began its expansion into the Caucasus region, where Russia had to fight off the already established rulers or powerful players in the Caucasus region, mostly with the Persian Empire with wars like these, and they had to fight off the Ottoman with wars like this. But even when officially taking over these lands and territory, the Russian Empire had to fight off the many Caucasian people who tended to greatly dislike the predicament they found themselves in, and at times Russia had to reassert their claim and control over the Caucasus Empire from the Persians or the Ottomans. Now during these many wars, the Caucasian people tried to make their own bid for independence, with the Circassian, I think that's how you pronounce it. Okay, YouTube, how do I pronounce this?
Circassian.
Circassian it is, I guess, with the Circassian people making their own bet and leading a guerrilla war against the Russian Empire starting in 1763. On the other side of the Caucasus at the same time, Imam Ghazi Muhammad, not Shamil, was able to unite Chechen and Dagestani Muslims under the idea of fighting a jihad or a ghazawat against Russian expansion. His band of fighters and supporters would end up forming the Caucasian Imamate in 1828 or 1829, and they were pretty good at this guerrilla warfare stuff, and at times were able to take over Russian positions and were even threatening the city of Grozny. But everything would change for Ghazi Muhammad when Russian forces were able to find his headquarters, where they would kick off the Battle of Gyumri in 1832, where Ghazi Muhammad and 192 fighters were killed. But Ghazi's second in command was able to escape, but he was too wounded to lead the imamate, causing Imam Hamza Bek would lead, who would die 4 years later. Following his death, Ghazi's second in command, Imam Shamil,
you guys say Colorado,
he would take control. And just by looking at his Wikipedia section on the Moridbor, seems very long, so I'm just gonna oversimplify it, but to show how much of a mad lad Shamil was seen by his own men. During Shamil's early rule of the Imamate, the Russians were able to besiege Shamil's forces at the siege of this place I can't pronounce. Shamil and his forces would fight against the Russians for about 3 months in the siege, until the Russians were able to break their defenses and storm the fort. During the storming of the fort, Shamil was able to escape with some of his men, his children, and his pregnant wife. But from everybody outside the fort, Imam Shamil and his fighters were all goners. Due to this, some Chechen and Dagestani tribes began to pledge their loyalty towards the Tsar, until one day Imam Shamil emerged from the forest and began to win back these tribes. Imam Shamil was able to unite even more tribes due to his popularity, and was able to proclaim his struggle against the Russians as a jihad, and proclaim that he would set up an independent imamate under Sharia. Imam Shamil was able to lead a guerrilla war against the Russian Empire, and it seemed pretty well, until the end of the Crimean War, where the Russian Empire would begin to double their efforts in the region until crushing Imam Shamil's imamate in 1859 and imprisoning him for life in St. Petersburg. On the other end of the Caucasus, the Russian
Circassian
War was also coming to an end. By the end of the 1870s, Russia had finally annexed the region, aka didn't suffer any major revolts of that level. Following the end of the Caucasian Wars, the
Circassian
would begin to face deportation by the Russian Empire, where they mostly moved towards the Ottoman Empire, and their homeland were replaced by Eastern European settlers. This would greatly affect the Circassian people, as hundreds and thousands were killed during these deportations, and the Circassian population in the area took a very hard dip. Following this, the Caucasus region seemed pretty chill, but y'all know what would happen later to the Russian Empire. World War I, where I'll skip over the whole Caucasian front and just skip towards the Russian Revolution and later Civil War. The Caucasus region would once again make a bid for independence during the Civil War, but these attempts also failed. Following the end of the Russian Civil War and the formation of the USSR, the Caucasian region would kind of chill until World War II, where Hitler kind of invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa. Can I trademark that? During the German invasion of the USSR, Nazi Germany would aim for the oil-rich regions of the Caucasus, mostly aiming for the oil fields of Baku. These series of military operations would be called the Battle of the Caucasus. By the end of the Battle of the Caucasus, Stalin would accuse the Chechen and Ingush people of cooperating with the Nazis. Whether this is true or not, the Chechen and Ingush people would begin to face massive deportation in 1944. Many of the deported Chechen and Ingush people were sent to the Kazakh SSR. During the deportation, many Chechen and Ingush people were killed on their way there and also killed on their way to the Kazakh SSR. This would be the situation until 1957, where desalinization would begin and the Chechen and Ingush people were allowed to return home, where they found the new Russian settlers in their area. And that totally didn't cause any ethnic or racial tensions. Right, guys? The USSR would later fall over and die in 1996 after being terminally ill since 1989, giving life to 15 independent republics and a de facto independent Chechnya.
Oh, hey, I'm just about to go to bed. I know we couldn't Skype tonight, but that's alright. Good night, girl. I'll see you tomorrow.
Where ex-Soviet Air Force General, Soviet-Afghan War veteran, and garrison guy, official term, Zohar Jadayev, stationed in Estonia, would make his way back home. And to oversimplify it, him and a band of Chechen fighters would storm local Soviet government buildings, proclaiming the formation of the Chechen Republic of Ichirya, which at the time made them one of the earliest republics to declare independence. Zohar Jadayev was then picked to become the head of the Chechen parliament. To greatly oversimplify Chechen independence, the Chechen state would start off with high hopes, but as time went on, the nation began to fall into crime, corruption, and political strife. Most of the political strife was mad at Jadayev's domestic policy, which was very lax to say the least when I just said crime and corruption like a sentence before. Political strife would explode in two coups against him. One in 1992, where he would then dissolve parliament, to one in 1994, and in the second coup, Russian supplies were found. And by Russian supplies, I also mean Russian troops and fighters were found. Boris Yeltsin would see this and was simply ordered to restore constitutional order. The Russians would first begin their war by bombing Grozny with military aircrafts, while also destroying the tiny Chechen Air Force, which I didn't know they had until researching this video. While this happened, Russian armored forces began to move their units into Chechnya, towards Grozny, storming the city on New Year's. The New Year assault for the Russians started off pretty well as the armored units would begin to make their way into the city with little to no resistance, until all of a sudden the city erupted into combat as Chechen defenders had lured the Russian units into the city to kick off a trap.
This is what's gonna win you the war.
Many of the Russian troops weren't trained for urban combat, or they didn't know the terrain, compared to some Chechen militias that had previous military experience. And on top of that, most of the militias were familiar with the local terrain as they grew up in Grozny or in Chechnya. Following the failed New Year assault, the Russians would pack up and would begin to set up a new plan to storm the city, which included the tactics of bombing, but also fighting block to block for the city against Chechen forces. And by the end of February, most of the Chechen resistance had died down, and the remaining hardcore forces would later flee the city by March, with most of the Chechen fighters setting up base in the mountain regions of Chechnya, and they would begin their guerrilla war against Russian forces. The guerrilla forces would then begin to gain support from many jihadists and volunteers from all over the Muslim world. And a urban myth about female Lithuanian sniper teams named the White Tigers, the last two who weren't jihadists. These jihadists would begin to raise funds for the Chechen cause, and they would also become a very effective fighting force in the war. The guerrilla portion of the war would see unimaginable horrors as both sides began to show little to no mercy between each other, and at times civilians were caught in the crossfire. But also, the wars in Chechnya are also known for their brutality towards civilians, with events like this Samashki massacre, where the villagers of Shamansky were killed by Russian paramilitary forces. This is just one example of the brutality that civilians faced during the war. This of course doesn't mean that the Chechen side were also innocent on not targeting civilians. As the war in Chechnya continued, some Chechen leaders would begin to target Russian cities. Not military targets, just cities. One of the most infamous strikes would be the Bujanov hostage crisis, where Chechen warlord Shamil Basayev would take control of a local hospital and would demand the pullout of Russian forces within Chechnya. The Russians would see this crisis and would storm the hospital, and they would fail. They would then storm the hospital one more time. Seeing the predicament they were in, the Russians would break a deal with Basayev, which they would set up a ceasefire among the many Chechen fighters and the Russian troops. Shamil and his men would then begin to make their way back to Chechnya, a part of the deal. By the end of the attack, 140 people were killed. The ceasefire would last, but when it ended, nothing had really changed and the Chechen campaign just continued for both sides. Now, with all this talk about the Chechen conflict and all these other guys, what happened to Zohar Jadayev? Wait, he's dead? And in August, Chechen fighters would pull a sneaky one on the Russian forces and would bypass the front line, lay siege to the city of Grozny, recapturing the city under the Operation Zero, named by this guy, and also Operation Jihad, named by Shamil Basayev, because hey, two factions are rising within the insurgency. The storming and taking of Grozny would be the final nail in the coffin for the Russians, and the war would come to an end in August 1996, where the Kasayov Accords were signed, which, to oversimplify this, the Russian and Chechen forces would have a ceasefire, and the Russians would pull out of Chechnya. The question of independence was just tossed to the side, and no one really answered this. And like so, Russia would leave Chechnya defeated and battered, while the Chechens would be able to maintain their independence and would regain what was left of their country. And once again, Chechen independence would then follow to corruption, political strife, and more gangsters. And now, they have a new and improved jihadist element. These jihadists, mostly Shamil Basayev and the foreign-born Ibn Khattab, would begin the Second Chechen War by invading the Dagestan region that was owned by Russia, after trying to help Dagestani Islamists and Dagestani separatists. The invasion of Dagestan and the following Russian bombing campaigns would begin to sway Russian opinion towards war against Chechnya, and once again bombs would begin to fall on Chechnya. But just like the last war, civilians were once again caught in the crossfire, and some were killed due to the overwhelming amount of Russian firepower. The Chechen resistance would then face another bombshell, pun intended. Now, since the end of the First Chechen War, discontent with the Chechen leadership and the many Wahhabi groups would begin to spread. This disillusionment would cause the Grand Mufti of Chechnya, Ahmed Kadyrov, to defect to the Russians with his own militia. The Battle of Grozny would once again repeat itself with all that depressing stuff, and the Chechen resistance would once again find themselves hiding in the mountains of Chechnya, where the Chechen insurgency became more and more religious and attacks against Russian civilians would begin to ramp up, with events like the Moscow theater siege and the Beslan school siege. As these attacks went on, public opinion would begin to sway away from Chechnya and towards Russia, and Russia was able to write off the war against the Chechen separatists as now a war against Islamic extremism during the early stages of the War on Terror. As the war went on, many previous Chechen commanders would be killed, like Shamil Basayev, who was killed while inspecting a mine. It blew up in his face is what I'm trying to say. Next would be the Chechen president Aslan Maskhadov, who now has a beard. He would be killed by SFB forces. And the foreign-born Ibn Khattab would be poisoned, not by tea, but by a letter. On the other side of the war, Ahmed Kadyrov, who funny enough called the First Chechen War a jihad, would be picked as the new leader of the Chechen Republic, which was now a part of Russia. Ahmed Kadyrov's militia would then fight side by side with Russian forces against Chechen separatists and fighters. Ahmed Kadyrov would also be killed in 2004, and the leadership was handed down to his son, Ramzan Kadyrov. As of today, the Chechen insurgency is not as big as it used to be during the 90s or early 2000s, and it kind of now is a low-level insurgency that has been able to spread towards Dagestan. As of now, there are groups pledging loyalty towards ISIS. Man, I feel like I'm forgetting something, like I'm not addressing an elephant in the room. Well, this has been the video about the Chechen conflict. Pretty depressing, just all together. I also read this book about the Chechen conflict, which I would recommend. It's pretty depressing, which is my segue towards the sponsor of this video. This video has been sponsored by the Ottoman Empire. Yes, they're once again sponsoring, and they're once again wanting you to subscribe to that 1-800 Suleiman. and the first 100 callers will get a free cannon that could break through your own Konstantin to Istanbul.